What would you do if a nation kept threatening war while its own navy could barely leave the harbor? Because that is exactly what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and the gap between what Iran says and what Iran can actually do just got caught on camera. Before we get into how one cargo ship exposed that gap, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because this channel breaks down exactly what is happening in this standoff before the headlines catch up, and you do not want to miss the next move. Let's go back to April 19th, 2026, out in the Arabian Sea, not far from the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian-flagged container ship called the Touska is moving fast, trying to slip past an American naval blockade that has only been in place for 6 days. Sailing alongside it is one of the busiest choke points on Earth, a strip of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a huge share of its natural gas normally passes. For weeks, Iran had been threatening to close that strait entirely. Now, for the first time in years, it was the United States deciding who got to use it at all. The Touska did not stop when it was told to. American commanders gave the crew 6 hours to comply, 6 hours of repeated radio warnings, 6 hours where the ship could have simply turned around. It kept going. So the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance opened fire, not at the hull, not at the bridge, but directly into the engine room. 3 rounds from a 5-inch gun, aimed with enough precision to stop the ship without sinking it or killing the crew. Within the hour, Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit were dropping out of helicopters launched from the USS Tripoli, rappelling down ropes onto a deck that, until that morning, belonged to Iran. Cameras were rolling. Within hours, the footage was public, and the American president was posting about it personally. This was not some quiet, unnoticed incident. It was the first time since this blockade began that the United States had actually opened fire on a non-military Iranian vessel, and it became the clearest sign yet that Tehran has spent this entire standoff talking like a country holding a winning hand, while its actual options at sea keep shrinking. Think about that for a second. This is a nation that had spent months threatening to shut down one of the most important trade routes on the planet, warning that any interference with its shipping would be treated as an act of war. And when the moment actually came, when an American warship opened fire on an Iranian-flagged vessel in broad daylight, there was no counterstrike, no direct confrontation, nothing but a furious statement calling it piracy. That contrast, the size of the threat versus the size of the response, is really the whole story of this standoff in miniature. To understand why one cargo ship mattered so much, you need to rewind further than this year, back to a war that most people outside the region were barely following until it exploded into something much bigger, and further still, back to how Iran learned to move oil and cargo while pretending the world could not see it. Iran's relationship with sanctioned shipping goes back years before this war ever started. After the 2018 collapse of the nuclear deal, Washington reimposed sweeping restrictions on Iranian oil exports. Facing economic strangulation, Iran chose a different path. Over time, it built what analysts now casually call a shadow fleet, aging tankers and cargo ships with murky ownership records, flags of convenience that get swapped every few months, and transponders that mysteriously stop broadcasting the moment a ship enters contested waters. Iran did not invent this playbook. Venezuela built something similar to survive its own sanctions. Russia expanded its version after the invasion of Ukraine triggered a fresh wave of Western restrictions. But Iran had a head start, and by the early 2020s, its shadow fleet was moving enough discounted crude to keep the country's finances limping along despite years of pressure from Washington. These ships rarely sail straight from an Iranian port to a final buyer. Instead, they loiter offshore, transfer cargo ship to ship in open water, and pass through transshipment hubs scattered across Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf, resurfacing under new names and new flags. Some of these hubs have functioned for years as exactly the kind of way station where a ship's paperwork can quietly grow murky before it continues on toward its real destination. None of that alone is unusual in the shipping world. Plenty of legitimate cargo passes through the same ports every day. What made this year different is that the United States stopped treating shadow shipping as a slow enforcement problem to be chipped away at over years, and started treating it as an active blockade to be enforced in real time, ship by ship, day by day. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel struck Iranian military targets directly, including a strike that killed Iran's supreme leader. That single event turned years of shadow conflict into open war. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, choking off a huge percentage of the world's oil and gas trade almost overnight. Fuel prices spiked. Insurance costs for shipping companies went through the roof. Vessels that once passed through the strait every single day either stopped moving or rerouted around the entire region. For weeks, the fighting continued. Then, on April 8th, Pakistan helped broker a fragile 2-week ceasefire. Direct talks followed in Islamabad between American and Iranian officials, the highest level face-to-face contact between the two countries since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. For a moment, it looked like there might be an actual off-ramp. It collapsed. By April 13th, with the talks in ruins, the United States shifted from limited strikes to something much bigger. A full naval blockade of every Iranian port. Warships spread across the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz with one order: nothing moves in or out of Iranian waters without American permission. That is a completely different posture than ordinary sanctions enforcement. Sanctions mean tracking suspicious ships and applying pressure from a distance. A blockade means physically shutting the door. Iran has been down this road before, just never quite like this. Back in 2019, Britain seized an Iranian tanker off Gibraltar, accused of shipping oil to Syria in violation of sanctions. Within weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard grabbed a British-flagged tanker in the Strait of Hormuz in direct retaliation. That became the pattern for years afterward. Quiet seizures, quiet retaliation, and diplomacy working things out behind closed doors, mostly out of public view. What happened with the Touska broke that pattern completely. This was not a quiet boarding buried in a shipping newsletter. This was filmed, narrated, and broadcast to the entire world within hours. So how does a blockade actually find one ship among the hundreds crossing that stretch of water every single day? It is not a wall stopping every vessel, because that would strangle global trade and turn friendly shipping nations into enemies overnight. Instead, think of it more like airport security, where most people walk straight through, and only the ones who trip certain flags get pulled aside. American forces track vessels using satellite surveillance, radar from warships on station, and automatic identification systems, the transponder signals that commercial ships are legally required to broadcast. An Iranian flag is a red flag on its own. Ownership records tracing back to sanctioned companies raise another. And a ship that suddenly goes dark, meaning its transponder mysteriously shuts off mid-voyage, is treated as close to a confession. Legitimate shipping has no reason to vanish from tracking systems. The Touska reportedly tripped several of these warning signs at once, and CENTCOM had already been building a case against vessels tied to sanctions evasion long before that specific morning. Once a ship is flagged, commanders face a genuine choice. And it says something important about how this entire operation is run. Sink the ship, and you destroy any cargo or evidence on board, and risk a humanitarian disaster if crew members die. Let it through, and the blockade means nothing. So the Spruance targeted the engine room specifically, disabling the ship while keeping it intact enough to search, intact enough to use as proof that the blockade has teeth. That is not an accident. That is a deliberate message aimed at every other captain considering the same run. The operation itself is called a VBSS, short for Visit, Board, Search, and Seizure, a tactic with a long history in counter-piracy work, though rarely carried out at this scale with this much of a spotlight on it. Marines dropping from helicopters onto a hostile deck sounds like something out of a movie, and visually it is. But functionally, once a ship's engines are dead, it is closer to an armed customs inspection than a battle. The real danger in these operations usually comes from the unknown, not knowing what damage, what booby traps, or what panicked crew members might be waiting below deck in the dark. There is a reason Washington chose to do this so publicly instead of quietly shadowing the ship and dealing with it diplomatically once it reached a friendly port. A quiet interdiction sends no message to the next captain thinking about testing the blockade. A filmed seizure, complete with a presidential post describing exactly what happened, sends one that is impossible to miss. It is less a legal maneuver, and more a demonstration built specifically to be watched by everyone still deciding whether America's threats carry real weight or are just words on a screen. The legal justification the United States has offered ties the blockade to enforcement of existing sanctions on Iranian military and weapons-related trade, giving American forces authority to search and seize vessels reasonably suspected of carrying prohibited cargo. Whether that framing would survive sustained scrutiny at something like the United Nations is a separate question from whether it is currently being enforced at sea. Right now, enforcement is the only variable that matters to any ship actually trying to cross that stretch of water. Before we go further into what this is actually costing both sides, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to understand what is actually happening in the Gulf instead of just scrolling past another headline. Now let's talk about the money, because the financial side of this conflict is honestly more brutal than most of the headlines let on. The United States claimed the blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day. The Department of Defense separately estimated Iran had already lost close to $5 billion in oil revenue within the first few weeks alone. By mid-May, CENTCOM reported that American forces had intercepted or redirected somewhere around 90 vessels attempting to move through Iranian waters since the blockade began, with only a handful of ships fully seized outright, the Touska among them. Independent maritime tracking suggested only a small number of attempted crossings actually slipped through unimpeded. For a country almost entirely dependent on oil exports and shipping revenue to keep its economy functioning, that kind of sustained pressure does not show up as one dramatic headline. It shows up as a slow, compounding bleed that gets worse every single day the blockade holds. It helps to understand what going dark actually means, because the phrase gets thrown around loosely in coverage of this war. Automatic identification system, transponders are supposed to broadcast a ship's location, speed, and identity continuously. Switching one off mid-voyage is technically simple, just a switch on the bridge. Shadow Fleet operators have turned this into something close to an art form. Transponders get shut off during the least monitored stretch of a route. Ship names and registries get repainted or reassigned at sea. Some vessels even engage in identity spoofing, briefly broadcasting the credentials of a completely different legitimate ship to throw off satellite trackers. None of it is foolproof. It is exactly the kind of pattern that, once spotted enough times on the same hull, builds the case file that eventually gets a ship intercepted. Iran's response to losing the Touska tells you a lot about where its actual military strength stands right now. There was no direct strike on an American warship. That kind of move would risk immediate, overwhelming retaliation that Iran's Navy, according to the Pentagon's own assessments, is in no condition to survive. Instead, Iran's Revolutionary Guard fell back on a tactic it has used for over a decade, seizing unrelated commercial vessels near its own coastline and holding them as leverage. Within days of losing the Touska, Iran detained additional foreign-flagged ships, accusing them of unspecified violations. Iranian officials also floated the idea of charging transit fees to any vessel passing through Hormuz, an attempt to claim some form of control over the strait through economic pressure, since military pressure was clearly off the table. There is also a quieter power struggle happening inside Iran itself between its conventional military and the Revolutionary Guard, an ideological force that controls much of the country's missile program and its regional proxy network. The Guard has largely driven the retaliation strategy throughout this war, leaning on proxy pressure and hostage-style ship seizures rather than direct confrontation, because Iran's regular Navy and Air Force are simply not equipped to sustain one. Every time Iranian state media highlights a tanker seizure instead of a naval engagement, that is a signal about who is actually setting policy behind the scenes, and the Guard has historically shown a much higher appetite for risk than Iran's diplomats or its conventional commanders. By June, there was real movement toward peace. Pakistan's Prime Minister announced that the United States and Iran had reached a memorandum of understanding. The blockade was lifted. Iran agreed to guarantee safe passage through the strait for 60 days, with no charge, while future control of the waterway would be worked out with Oman and other Gulf states. It was signed by both presidents. For a moment, it genuinely looked like this chapter might be closing. It did not hold. By early August, the United States had reimposed its naval blockade, citing renewed attacks on commercial vessels in the region and accusing Iran of targeting several Arab states. Just days ago, monitoring groups reported dozens of incidents of damage to ships in and around the Strait of Hormuz since the war first began in February, including fresh drone strikes on tankers this month. An alternative shipping route through Omani waters, meant to give commercial vessels a safer path around the most contested waters, has actually become the highest risk stretch of water in the region, accounting for the overwhelming majority of recent projectile strikes. In other words, the off-ramp everyone hoped for in June turned out to be a temporary pause, not an ending. Think about what that means for a moment. Both governments sat down, signed something with their own names on it, watched it get announced to the entire world, and then let it collapse within weeks. That is not a small diplomatic hiccup. It is a pattern. And patterns tell you far more about what is likely to happen next than any single press conference does. Every time one side accuses the other of breaking the agreement first, both governments get to publicly blame the other without ever having to explain why their own commitments did not hold either. It would be easy to reduce all of this to a clean story about American strength against Iranian weakness, or flip it around into a story about American aggression against a cornered state. Neither version survives contact with the actual details. Washington argues that a country running sanctioned shipping to fund its military and its regional proxy network forfeits some claim to unrestricted passage through international waters. Iran argues that a foreign navy disabling and boarding its commercial ships, regardless of what is in the cargo hold, amounts to an act of war. Both arguments have some internal logic, even though Iran's own long record of evading sanctions makes its outrage a little harder to take at face value. And behind every one of these seizures are real people who never had a say in any of it. Crew members on ships like the Touska, sailors doing a job, caught in the middle of a geopolitical standoff they did not create. Merchant sailors have been killed or gone missing during this conflict. At least one tugboat has been sunk. Multiple merchant vessels have been damaged badly enough to be abandoned at sea. A port worker was killed and others wounded in an attack in Bahrain. Families on both sides have absorbed consequences that never make it into a CENTCOM press release or a state media broadcast. That part of the story rarely trends, but it is the part that actually matters most. Think about the wider ripple effect, too. Every time this strait gets more dangerous, insurance premiums for shipping companies climb. Some vessels simply stop going through at all, choosing a longer, more expensive route around the entire region instead. Fuel costs creep upward for countries that have nothing to do with this conflict. None of that shows up as a single dramatic headline, but it is a quiet tax that spreads outward from one narrow stretch of water to gas stations and shipping docks thousands of miles away. If you have made it this far, drop a comment telling me which side you think is bluffing harder right now, because I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next on this channel. So where does this actually go from here? A few paths seem realistic, and they carry very different levels of risk. The first is a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, something firmer than the June agreement that fell apart within weeks. Given that both sides have already walked away from one signed deal this year, betting heavily on a second one holding without a much stronger enforcement mechanism feels optimistic at best. The second, and probably the more likely path based on the pattern so far, is continued proxy pressure rather than direct confrontation. Iran keeps leaning on regional allies and on seizing unrelated commercial ships as bargaining chips, a strategy that lets it project strength at home without inviting the kind of overwhelming retaliation a direct strike on American forces would guarantee. It is a strategy Iran has shown again and again it is willing to use, because it is one of the only cards left in its hand that does not immediately risk total military collapse. The risk here is that every additional incident pushes oil prices higher and edges other regional powers closer to getting pulled in directly, whether they want to be or not. The third path is Iran trying to reassert control over Hormuz through economic coercion, things like transit fees or new coordination requirements, since military coercion is currently not realistic. This is a real possibility, specifically because it costs Iran very little militarily, while forcing Washington to either escalate to stop it or watch the credibility of its own blockade quietly erode. But there is a problem with this path, too. Washington has repeatedly framed free passage through Hormuz as a red line, and any attempt to functionally toll or close the strait almost certainly triggers an immediate American military response, one that Iran's Navy is in no condition to answer. There is a fourth possibility, too, one that gets less attention because it is less dramatic than a strait closure or a diplomatic breakthrough, but it might actually be the most realistic outcome of all. This war simply grinds on in its current shape, neither fully resolved nor fully escalated, with the blockade tightening and loosening in cycles depending on whatever the latest incident happens to be. No dramatic turning point, just a slow, grinding standoff that keeps draining Iran's economy, while occasionally flaring into headlines like the Touska seizure before fading back into the background again. Given how many times this exact cycle has already repeated this year, that outcome might honestly be the safest bet of all. There is also a domestic dimension that rarely gets enough attention. Admitting weakness publicly in a political system built substantially on projecting strength and resilience carries its own steep cost inside Iran. That is likely part of why Iranian officials keep insisting publicly that Iran alone will decide when this war ends, even while its actual military options keep narrowing by the week. That statement is not really aimed at the Pentagon. It is aimed at an audience back home, an attempt to project control at exactly the moment control is hardest to demonstrate. And it helps explain why Iran's public position looks almost contradictory, claiming openness to renewed talks in one breath while insisting in the next that it has no intention of sitting back down with Washington anytime soon. That is not necessarily a messaging failure. It might be an accurate reflection of a government that wants the fighting to stop, but cannot be seen asking for it first. None of these paths are guaranteed. Wars this tangled rarely move in a straight line, and small miscalculations, a warning shot that lands wrong, a proxy attack that kills the wrong person, a ship that refuses to stop when it should, have a way of reshaping everything within a matter of days. That unpredictability is exactly why this story is worth watching closely, instead of catching it secondhand once it has already changed shape. And underneath all of it sits the simple, uncomfortable math. A Navy the Pentagon describes as badly weakened. An economy losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single day it stays cut off from global shipping. A diplomatic track record that includes walking away from its own signed agreements not once, but repeatedly. Iran keeps talking like it is holding a strong hand at the table. But every seized ship, every frozen dollar, every failed agreement makes that hand a little harder to hide. A bluff only works as long as nobody actually calls it. And for months now, the United States has been calling it methodically, one intercepted vessel at a time. The Touska was never really just about one cargo ship. It was the moment the gap between what Iran claims and what Iran can actually enforce became visible to the entire world. Caught on camera, posted within hours, impossible to spin away. Months later, with the blockade back in place and attacks on shipping still climbing, that gap has not closed. If anything, it has gotten wider. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close this out. Every side in this conflict keeps talking about ships, oil, and blockades as if this were purely a numbers game. But every single one of those numbers represents a decision made by real people who then had to live with the consequences. A crew member on the Touska who had no say in what cargo was loaded onto that ship, a sailor on a tugboat that never made it back to port, a family somewhere in the Gulf waiting for news about a relative working on a vessel that got caught in the crossfire of a war they had nothing to do with starting. It is worth remembering that underneath the strategy and the statistics, this is still a story about people whose lives got pulled into something much bigger than they ever asked to be part of. Watch what happens the next time a ship tries to run this blockade. That single moment will tell you more about the real state of this standoff than any statement coming out of any foreign ministry on either side. So here is the question worth sitting with. Does a government keep bluffing once everyone at the table can already see its hand? Or is refusing to fold the only move a cornered regime believes it has left? Type your answer below. And if you want to be here the moment this actually breaks one way or the other, subscribe now because this story is far from finished.